they need, and really nobody is at the average. There's no student that is at the average. I taught a 5th grade class of 34 students. I had 2 5th graders that were at the 5th grade level, and the curriculum was designed for those 2 students. But I had 32 other students that had a totally different set of needs. So I think this.
Well, I think you're right, Gabrielle. You met the students where they were, not where they were supposed to be. If you want the most information.
Back into this, it's also where in that relationship. I think often we in higher education leave out that faculty conversation with the students because 90% of the conversation really is in the product, which is where you sell a seat with the opportunity to engage in everybody's gray matter in the classroom or outside of the classroom in the 24-hour span, right? And faculty talk about, I don't want a 3 o'clock a.m. email. I'm finally going to sleep, right? Where some students are, that's when they're engaging. How do we do that? I don't hear anybody talking about what we're doing with our faculty, which I think is the predominant conversation. Financial aid is a blip. It's a very important blip. Registrar is even a tinier blip, very important blip. But how do we look at where our product really is?
All right, so it'll go to the next question. I think this goes back to our original, and we talked about all the places you need to go through the engagement thought process. Because right now we only use CRMs to communicate policy and procedures with, right? So just think about it. If you only communicated with your bank on a policy, terms, most of the time when you see terms, you just pass it and hit agree and you get away, go, right? Well, that's what we do with our students. We engage based on terms. Hey, this rule, what I call the exclusive, you got to be doing this to get in here. I'm a believer we have to become really inclusive. And so faculty is really important. Why? Because they spend a lot of time there. Clubs are really important. Engagement. So one of my clients, the CIO, said to me, how do we engage when people are virtual? Right? That discussion is still out there. How do you engage? Well, the conversation I had with her is, you got to figure out what makes your campus, what's the affinity to your campus, you know?
And I'm just going to add, that's so important because if you talk about alumni and development, if you don't have affinity to your campus, you're not giving back once you're an alumnus. And so it's that whole string through, right?
Yeah.
How do you get the next new building or the next new technology money to support the engagement?
Yeah. No, that's an interesting one. And I know there's smaller schools that have really what I would call community and culture and you know, not to plug my daughter's school, but like Baylor, man, their community is amazing. Like I don't even go there and I want to be like wearing green, right? How do you do that? The Bulldogs, you have that culture, right? Like, how do you do that with it?
It's the Butler way. I mean, from the minute you walk in that door, everyone talks about the Butler way, and this is what it means, and this is how you're part of the community.
Yeah.
And we're small.
So
it's easier. We have 5,500 students.
Which is okay, but how do you communicate that out to them? How do you engage them? Is it personal?
A lot of it is personal. Yeah, and it goes back to the faculty here. You don't have to hold that for me. Thanks.
I feel like it.
I remember so many years ago when I started working at Butler, I was working on a degree there as well. And there was a group of 5 students, including me, that we wanted to take 2 sections. You know, it was a requirement. It was a math requirement, I think. And so the 5 of us went to the professor we wanted to teach it and said, will you teach this in summer? And 5 students saying that we want these 2 sections back to back was enough for the registrar to schedule that class.
That's pretty great.
And, you know, 5 students. It's that level of personalization that makes a difference.
I think while we're passing it off, one of the things, and it's kind of a $1 million question, is how do you be everything to everyone? And sometimes you have to think about it simply. And we think about a college campus, but what is it? It's a community that has 2 sides, and this is at its simplest form. One of those is a very fluid and diverse and beautiful population in your students, but also in you all as employees, in your prospective students, in your alumni, and even in the broader community that many of you all claim to serve as an anchor up. On the other side, the reality is that you have very static services resources, offerings, and opportunities. And so the question, or how you answer that question of being everything to everyone, is really just making the space between those two sides more personalized, more simple, and more relevant, and frankly, more expedient. And then that can be a tide that can rise many boats that we read and hear about and talk about so often.
And so I'm Brian Dixon. I'm the Vice Provost of Enrollment at University of Texas at Austin. I work with William. So what I would
South by
say,
Southwest.
there you go, absolutely. So what I would say is, I am the dad of two Butler graduates. Our youngest just moved to Seattle yesterday. And so my mom always used to say the best way to communicate care is to actually care. So I think there's a challenge that there is relational credibility issues that we have as institutions because we have this deficit mindset towards our students where we tend to believe it's their fault that they're in the situation that they're in. And the students that we tend to want to communicate with the most have experienced organizational trauma, and we've lost credibility with them. And we have to figure out how do we engage the disengaged. And we don't even think about trying to solve that problem because we have trained our organizations to believe that it's the system's fault, right? So it's this ambiguous, authority that has put us into this place that we are. And so that's led to a mindset that says, it's not my fault, so I don't need to think critically. I don't need to reflect on how I could make things better or get different technology or revisit my policy or do any of those things because it's the system's fault. It's the way that it works. And we need to kind of recognize that technology is not magic like Hogwarts, right? Like that we have control, we have charge, and we can make volitional choices and decisions. So,
just from the vendor side, frankly, even as recently as a couple of weeks ago with one of our partners in the Big Ten, we went to go do some design thinking sessions for some new features we're working on. And we requested that we meet with about 500 students over the course of a couple of days. And they said, well, sure. And we said, we have all these different student advisory councils and our SGA. And we said, well, whoa, that's great. We want to meet with them. But those students are going to be engaged no matter what. So we need to meet with your student workers. We need to meet with Pell Grant students. And so it's that mindset of not just going to those campus leaders, but going to the everyday student to actually figure out what they need and what they want in order to actually have a good experience on campus.
Yeah, I just wanted to just come back to what Brian had said about, really communicating with students that have had this institutional trauma. And I just think that also goes back to what Carla had talked about earlier, which is this, creating this relationship of comfort, I believe are the words that you use. And that is so important when we're even thinking about how to even utilize any of this technology. So what I'm really hearing from all of you is that it's really important that we focus on the culture of care, the relationship, and building that trust with our students. And so moving forward, we have this is our last question for this session. What are some of the strategic engagement strategies that will foster a better user experience? Okay, so strategic engagement strategies can cover all sorts of things. So we'd love to hear from you what that means and how you think we can create that better user experience. And then of course we have our stickies here. You can vote up if it's something you agree with. You can also use these other stickies to categorize those strategies.
And I think the one, and Irfan, I'll come to you if you have, one of the things I want to go back to what Brian said, is that we, for years, have always said it's the fault of the student for not following the policies that we have put in front of them. This is where where I say we have to start becoming very inclusive as opposed to being exclusive. You have to have this. You have to have this rule. You need to do this. It has this very exclusiveness to, and yet we're trying to have retention. We're trying to get people to feel have affinity with the campus. Yet we put all these barriers. I call them these things laying on the track that we don't do really well because it's laying on the track. What's up, Anita? How are you doing over there? Good to see you. But I think this is probably maybe we do a whole ThinkSpace on almost the exclusiveness of how we operate in higher ed. And I'm not saying that we can't not do it because we still have to have protocols, we still have financial aid regulations, we still have things that we're really accountable for because funds are coming from the state and the government. We still need to have all those. How do we use data integration, all these things that make it seamless to put these strategies in place? Go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I was just going to say it's really interesting that one of the responses on here is to actually start engaging before they are students. And a lot of times we just think about the student. But what you are saying is that it actually starts before they're even students, and then it continues until after they are students.
And I was just going to say, Matt, to agree with you is, in higher ed, we talk about persistence, we talk about resiliency, we talk about grit, but the reality is that your students have proven those. They're there, and a lot of them have overcome challenges to get there. But it becomes really hard to maintain those traits when they're overwhelmed, when there's so much noise instead of a signal. You know, putting a tool in their hands isn't proving their capability, it's actually shining a light on it, is something that can be really, really important.
So the last one here is build a metaverse community to make it easier for students to communicate. Now, I'm sure Fong in the back could have this conversation here, where these virtual ecosystems are going to come into play, right? Who would have thought texting is what everyone wants? Like, I'm a former registrar, and I remember my boss is saying, we can't take faxes. I used to have that argument, like, why can't we take faxes? Well, we need the ink. And we will always need paper, and we went to the fax. And then it went from fax, and we can't have email, we don't know who that's coming from. Then it went from email to like, if you think about it, so the reason I'm saying is, metaverse seems so far away, but in 5 years from now, all these places are gonna have metaverses inside of your community, because it goes to that virtual side of the world.
I'll just not push back on that, but the reality is that there's a lot of momentum in the metaverse, in crypto, and so on and so forth, and it's exciting, but we can't forget that people are struggling in the real world. And so there needs to be a tool that's actually helping them with the physical world, with their actual campus.
Can it be complementary though? Can it? So I think strategy shouldn't be just one. I think it isn't an or, it's an and. You like the and?
Yeah.
And that's what I would say, agree with Matt on that, because, you know, during the pandemic, or I know the pandemic is still going on, but during this time that we've been in, a lot of universities have been like, how can we be virtual first for the semester, or virtual first for a certain time period? I think we should push with what Matt sort of said is, why does virtual only need to be the secondary option? Why does it always need to be that? Why can't it just be a part of the strategy?
The A option.
Yeah.
Like, I always think whenever it says, oh, you got to do it this way, it's because not everyone learns the same way, not everyone interacts the same way. I'm much more outward. I love people. Like, I love hanging out with you guys. Kumbaya, we can come and have fun. But there's people that are like, you know what, just text me.
Right. But then when we
I
do,
think I may be one of those people, Matt. I may be one of those people.
Yeah.
when we do create that virtual option, sometimes it becomes an afterthought. I also love engagement. I love being in person and great. But then sometimes when like, oh, we have a virtual option, here's a Zoom link, and we'll talk to you later. Or you can just kind of follow along as we go. We need to create a better, well, I don't know what would be better, but it's like we need to be able to engage more virtually.
Not to come off as, you know, the old man yelling at the clouds, but, you know, we're talking a lot about the metaverse now, which is Web 3.0, and higher ed is still adjusting to Web 2.0. And so in order to actually get to that point, there has to be an actual foundation of Web 2, which is interaction, which is mobile applications. There's a lot of platforms out there that can get to that point, and that's that then building block. And so while it is an and, I think it's careful not to skip a step.
So the great thing about these ThinkSpaces is we start seeing topics, and then we're going to throw it up. Because one of the topics, I know we're on a countdown to 1 minute. Gabrielle keeps me in check. You know, so I think there is conversations about what engagement is and what type of platforms, because I think we need to have a Web 2, Web 3. What does it mean? What does a metaverse mean? What does blockchain mean? Like, those are the conversations, honestly, I'm having all the time, because the ERPs need all of these things wrapped around it, because the engagements need to be there, right? So,
Yep. I was also just going to say, I do feel like we need to do additional ThinkSpaces on this topic in these different areas, because one thing that we didn't even get a chance to really touch on was the actual academic experience, which is most of what the student experiences on campus. And I think that really goes back to what multiple people in here have talked about, which is if we want to put the student first, we actually have to put the people that are serving the students first and find out from them what is actually happening and what is going on. So it really stems from that level of trust, which it seems like, what's her name? Michelle, which it seems like what Michelle has on her campus. 5 students said, hey, we need this, we want this course done, right? How many other institutions can say that? Definitely not the one I went to. So these are all amazing points, and I'm not sure if any other
we're coming
closing-
we're gonna bring this plane down for landing. I want to say one, this is a Promethean board. Promethean is our partner, has done a lot of good work with us. We use Promethean boards just so that we engage. You can see how we're using it. I just want to make sure that you recognize that Promethean is allowing this to happen. I want to say thank you to Cooper for joining us from Raw. I also want to say thank you to each of you for coming out, and I'm hoping you'll give feedback, because one of the things we're trying to get the Hug to recognize is that if we could have sessions that allow for your voice to be heard, I think every session would be much more valuable to you. Now, I'm not against I want to listen, I want to sit back. Like for people like me that like this interaction, I'm hoping you will see it. We have 5 more left. The next one is the new tradition. And then we have one called YIT. Like, I think it's a packed house of that one. Why are we having IT here? So I think that's good. And then I want to invite you guys to our wine event. Stop by. I know you all have different other events. Stop by, get a glass of wine to start, and go and do other stuff, or cap it. Either way. But I want to say thank you to everyone. Appreciate it. Stay around. Hold on one second.
I'm just going to steal the mic for a second. I'm Michelle Thibodeau. I'm on the Hug board, and you have the Hug's ear, and we love what you guys are doing. We love the webinars and the discussions we've had the months leading up to this, and we will continue this and fill out the surveys. Tell us what else to do so that we have sessions like this, because this is fantastic.
Thank you, Michelle. And there's a little bit of trust, right?
It is.
That I think relationships and partnerships with our schools, I asked them to do things that they never thought about doing. I think I asked the same thing to the Hug, like, let's do it. And I think it starts and momentum happens, and I've talked about NSTs and all these things for the Hug. Like, I'm saying things like, hey, and the Hug is willing to do it. Why? Because I believe they have the largest and the strongest community, because they're the actual people doing the work, that interact with students. So I'm a believer of the Hug, and that's why I put a lot of time into this. And I want you all to recognize that they are also doing it. And I love the fact that there's a lot of people here at Hug.
Yes.
Very good. So give everyone, did everyone get their little candy bar as their gift? Got it?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Matt, thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.